Let's take a look at the elements of art and how we can use these principles to create more interesting digital artwork. So the elements of art are the fundamental components of a painting or an illustration, or even like a sculpture, any kind of art that's visual art. The 7 elements are texture, form, space, shape, color, value, and line. And most artwork contains one or more of these elements, usually more than one. Most artists use them unintentionally, but you can use them intentionally as well, just to make your artwork more appealing to people who are going to look at it. So I'm going to show you some different examples of how I use it and just explain what each of these do and how you can use them for your work. So we'll start with texture. Texture is sometimes implied by using different colors and different values like I did here. I'm implying kind of a marble texture, even though it doesn't really physically have a texture because it's just on my screen. However, it looks like it has a texture. Texture could also be an actual physical texture. You could have the texture of clay if you have a sculpture, or you could have the texture of oil paint on canvas if you do traditional paintings on canvas. So there's lots of ways to use texture. Texture really makes something look like it exists and it's in an environment and it's real. And it's especially good to use if you're doing digital art because it's going to make your artwork look more physical. So texture is really easy to use in Painter. A couple of the ways really quickly to do it without going into too much detail. You can use the custom sponge to throw on some texture, or you could even use the square chalk brush along with a paper texture here to paint in some texture. You can watch my video on texture to learn more about how to do this in more detail. Let's look at an example of texture from one of the paintings I did in 2012. You can see in this painting I used a lot of texture in this piece. All along the wall here and on the ground especially. I want it to look like there's a lot of just little bits of rocks and gravel and things. And then it works really well too on the person's clothing here, where I put this brown texture that looks like dirt, and it makes it look really weathered and really used. If I hadn't have done that, you might not really get the point of this painting, that the person's not really in a very good condition here. So the next one we have is form. Form relates to three-dimensionality of a shape or an object. And so in this example, I've used the airbrush to shade some of this and kind of distorted it a little bit to make it look like it has a form, like maybe it's three-dimensional plastic. Form works together with shape, but again, form relates more to three-dimensionality. Form is a combination of primitive shapes generally. So in this example, this F is a cylindrical shape combined with a couple more cylindrical shapes. The O is just a torus, and then the same thing with the rest of the other shapes here. They're just combinations of primitive shapes. So oftentimes when you're drawing, you'll use primitive shapes to build up your form. If you're drawing a head and then a neck and then a torso and shoulders and so on, you're using form to establish that. You're also using color and value along with shape to establish this form. So you'll notice that some of these go together. Form works with shape and color and value. So a lot of these are interchangeable with each other. Some are dependent on each other even. Let's take a look at an example of form. Here I have another painting that I did in 2012, and we have this spherical shape here. Now, if I didn't pay attention to my form and imply that form by shading it properly using value and color and texture, this would look like a flat disk. It wouldn't look like a round sphere. So I had to imply that form when I was drawing it. Same thing goes with the body down here. There's a lot of form implied in this painting here. And getting it right really makes or breaks the piece, as far as trying to translate this really simple message here. Next, we will move on to space, and space can be positive space or negative space. This would be positive space, and outside of that would be negative space. So in this example of space, there's different levels of space. There's this area outside, there's the white area surrounding it, and then there's the negative space inside. So there's 3 levels of space here. Space is generally almost always used in your artwork because you either have to fill the page or not fill the page, so you're going to be using space no matter what, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It's generally used for composition. In this case, for this diagram I made here, I've used space. I have everything kind of more or less, centered, and there's a certain amount of space between everything. I just kind of did this, naturally, however I felt like doing it. I didn't have to, read any instructions on how to space things. I just kind of did it this way. So, you'll probably do a lot of these things naturally, but it's just nice to know that they're there if you weren't aware of them. So we'll take a look at space. Here's a painting I did last year of a peacock. It's got the body of the peacock taking up the positive space, and then the negative space is taken up by the tail and the rest of the composition. Furthermore, I used the rule of thirds to divide the canvas into equal segments, and you can see that running down the center 2 thirds, that's where I placed the peacock's body, and then everything else takes up the rest. So multiple uses of space here in this painting. The next we'll look at is shape, and as I mentioned before, shape kind of is similar to form. It works with form, but it's slightly different. Shape deals more with 2D, and form is more 3D. So shape is kind of the contour, and then if you were to fill it in and make it look 3-dimensional, then that would be form. So they are kind of interchangeable. So in this shape here, I have it as kind of the shape of a fish, just so you can see, it's more of a contour thing. To show you an example of shape, we have this piece I did here. I did this one also last year, and you can see it doesn't really have any form to it as far as 3-dimensional shading goes, but there is form implied by using shapes on top of shapes, or intersecting shapes, or cutting shapes out of each other. There's a lot of 3-dimensional depth without anything really being actually 3-dimensional. It's all kind of 2-dimensional shapes. I don't know what this is. I can't begin to describe it. It's just kind of an abstract piece I did. I just kind of started doodling, and that's what it ended up as. But it's a really good use of space, and you can also see, as I mentioned earlier, I used some of the other elements in conjunction with shape. I used texture here on this background, and the whole thing kind of has a texture to it. So that's shape. The next one is color. Color is pretty straightforward. It deals more with the hue here, and color is really easy to pick in Corel Painter. You have your hue ring here. You can pick any hue you want, and you can fine-tune the color however you want. We're going to deal more with the color right now rather than value. So color seems pretty easy, right? You just pick a color. Well, you want to think more about that. You want to pick colors that harmonize with each other, that look good when they're next to each other or grouped together. So I have a video on color theory that you can watch that'll give you some more insight into that. But basically, you want to use colors that are harmonious. So for instance, this yellow here is the complementary color of this blue down here at the bottom. So if you use these two together, it's going to make your artwork look really interesting. I'll do it as an example here. These two colors go really nicely together. You could say the same for magenta and this aqua color. So color is very important, and how you use it's very important. You don't want to just throw down colors, randomly, if you want your artwork to look good. So an example of color would be this. This is just a big mess. I don't know what it's supposed to be. I'm just kind of playing around with color in this example here. So what I was most interested in is how this gray perceptually changes when it's surrounded by all of this magenta here. So the magenta is so bright and overwhelming that when the gray is next to it, the gray kind of takes on this aqua kind of green tint. And when I mentioned earlier about the complementary colors, we have this magenta here. Opposite from it is aqua. And so what's kind of happening is we're kind of almost perceiving this gray as being some color here with a little bit of the opposite complementary color influenced in it. So I don't know if you can see it in this example because there's some other colors going on here, but if you were to cover up part of the screen and only look at just the little area here, this gray and some of these grays might look like they're kind of tinted towards green a little bit, like they're not actually pure gray. We can see that by sampling these colors here. I'm sampling this gray here, and you can see that it's just a neutral gray, but with all this other magenta around it, it looks a little different. I threw a couple little other colors in here, like this blue just for fun, and over here I actually did shift the color perceptually towards this green that I was talking about. So it's kind of interesting. What I see here, this color, I also kind of see over in all of the other grays too. So it's just kind of a way to mess with people's heads when they're looking at your art. You can use color to do that, and this piece really only focuses on color. I wasn't trying to use any of the other elements here, even though I did unintentionally. There's some spatial relations between the gray, and there's some line, and there's some texture and things. So moving on from color, we'll go to value next, and value is essentially the percentage of lightness or darkness that something has. So white to black and everything in the middle doesn't necessarily have to be just black and white. It could be dark blue or light blue. It could be monochromatic. You use a value in a lot of different ways to change your color or to establish your form or even texture. So value is very important. It also really establishes contrast, and you need contrast in a piece for it to really stand out and for people to be able to see things clearly. So an example of value is this piece here that I made last year in 2012. And you can see it doesn't have a whole lot of hue going on. There's only one hue. It's kind of this orange-yellow hue, and that doesn't change really. The only thing that changes is the value. So we have a dark hue here, and then if we sample around, we can see it's really just moving lighter and darker in value. And it's the balance, the ratio of this dark to light and everything in the middle that creates contrast. And you have to have this contrast for things to look good, especially if you're doing realistic artwork. So you should practice doing monochromatic or black and white paintings to get better at this. It really helps you get good at shading, because then you're not thinking about color and hues so much. Finally, we have line, and line can be just a bunch of lines. You know, you could draw a bunch of spaghetti and that could be your artwork, or you can use lines to enhance your forms, which is what I'm doing here. So these lines are kind of just following contours and kind of making things stick out. They're delineating from the form. So what you want sometimes is a good balance of form and line. And if you have too much form and not enough line, your artwork might not look as good. And same goes the other way around. If you have too much line and not enough form, you know, if your artwork's just a bunch of senseless spaghetti, you know, it might not really look that good. But even this is a form, so sometimes there's no way of getting out of making more elements in art than you intend to make. They kind of just happen. That's the cool thing about them. That's what makes them the fundamental elements of art. So let's take a look at an example of line as our last example. It's a painting I did in 2011, and I'm really concentrating on lines and brushstrokes in this, primarily. Secondarily, maybe color, and then third is texture. But it's just a bunch of lines, and I know that sounds really fundamental, but when you look at it, it kind of looks like maybe it's a really close-up of some woven fabric or some natural fiber, you know, in biology, you know, collagen or something weird. So it's really, you know, this is mostly lines, but it looks really cool. And again, as I mentioned earlier, most of these paintings, if not all of them, have more than one or a lot of the elements of art that I described. So this has texture and color and value, space. You know, it's got pretty much everything to it. Doesn't really have a whole lot of form, really, because everything fills the screen, and I didn't really do a whole lot of three-dimensional shading, but there's some stuff there. I guess there's, in a way, a form implied by this lattice. Makes kind of a bulging grid, so maybe this does have everything. But it's interesting to look at your work and see what you've used and what you haven't. And again, as I mentioned, it's not something that you have to use or you have to think about. You don't have to have this list next to you and check them off one by one and go, you know, okay, did I use texture? Okay, good. And then I use form, all right. You don't have to worry about that. Just do it automatically, and then if you need some inspiration now and then and you don't know where to start on something, think about one of these concepts, you know, and start with that. Space is generally the easiest to start with, and just figure out where everything's going to be positioned. I have a video on composition you can watch coming up soon that'll help you with the rule of thirds and spatial relations and all of that stuff. So have fun applying this to your digital artwork. I encourage you to experiment with all of these, and thanks for watching.